we have a great set of presenters and discussants. Today we will hear from Akufu Amankwa and Sydney Gourlay. They're both with the Living Standards Measurement Study Group within the World Bank. They're both economists, but with a background in survey methods, specifically on agriculture. And they've been working on collecting high-frequency surveys in a combination of countries in Africa over the last 9 months. So it's really exciting to hear what they've been finding and what this tells us around agriculture and food security. We also have a great set of discussants. So Dr. Verne will be discussing for us, as well as Aslihan Arslan. Aslihan's from IFAD, and Dr. some of you may know very well from the bank. She leads our FCV and food security work with a specific focus on Africa. And Aslihan has a wealth of experience on agricultural productivity, youth in rural areas, and other aspects of agriculture. So on that note, I'd like to kick us off and get us going. I would like to request a couple of things from the participants. Firstly, just to take into consideration bandwidth issues, if the audience would be able to turn off their video, that would help a lot, and also their microphones mute during the presentation. And then I would also invite the participants to send questions through the chat. That'll be on the right-hand side of the WebEx window. We'll be gathering the questions that you guys send in and bringing up in the Q&A during this session. So thanks again for everyone for joining us. And now I'd like to hand it over to Akufu. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura, for the introduction and for offering to chair this webinar. And then thanks to the Ag and Food GP for hosting this webinar. We really appreciate. And then we also thank the discussants for offering to provide feedback on these presentations. And we also thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedule to come join us in this webinar. We really appreciate your time and your contribution. So Sydney and I will be presenting results from a high frequency phone survey in 5 African countries, focusing on agriculture and food security in the face of COVID. So as a way of background, I wouldn't want to say much about the background because we all know what is going on around the world in terms of COVID-19, and definitely African countries in Africa have not been spared of the negative impact of the COVID-19 crisis. As a result of the negative effects of the pandemic, governments in the region responded by implementing various containment measures, some ranging from nationwide lockdown to partial lockdowns, including school closures, ban on social gatherings, movement restrictions, among others. These movement restrictions implemented by governments in the region have implications on the socioeconomic lives of the citizenry, specifically as it pertains to food security, given the fragile nature of the food security situation in the region, as well as, of course, the agriculture sector in past crisis as documented by FAO in their state of food insecurity. But in times of crisis like this, the agriculture sector normally serves as a buffer, economic and employment buffer for households, especially poor households. But then for us to be able to really get policies and start geared at understanding the impact of the pandemic on food security and agriculture, it is important for us to understand how and which households have been impacted and the coping mechanisms that these households are employing to mitigate the negative impacts of the pandemic. But then for us to do that, will require that micro level data is available. But with the lockdown restrictions implemented by government in the region, that disrupted traditional face-to-face household level data collection. So what we intend to achieve with this webinar is to use phone survey data from 5 African countries to examine the impact of COVID-19 crisis on household agriculture and food security. And then also we will appreciate inputs from the Agriculture and Food Global Practice going forward in designing the questionnaires for future rounds of the high frequency phone survey. So in terms of the data that we are using comes from 2 sources. One is the high frequency phone survey, and then the other one is from the most recent face-to-face interview of the same households that we are following in the high frequency phone survey. So around March, April, when the pandemic started, the World Bank's Living Standard Measurement Study Team and the Poverty Global Practice established a collaboration with national statistics offices and other partners to conduct multiple rounds of phone surveys. And these phone surveys that the team is collaborating with the national stats offices builds on foundations of the longitudinal household survey program established under the Living Standards Measurement Study and integrated surveys on agriculture. So the LSMS ISA program is a project that supports the implementation of multi-topic household surveys in 7 African countries focusing on agriculture. And for purposes of this study, we wanted to ensure that cross-country comparison is feasible. So we did adopt a uniform methodology in sampling, weighting, and then implementation of these phone surveys across the countries that the LSMS team supports. So we have a dedicated website where data and documentation of the phone surveys can be found, and of course this same set of information can equally be found on the World Bank's microdata. So given that the phone survey, first of all, will require that households selected to participate in the phone survey are households with phone numbers, and so there is some sort of selection bias, right? So for us to be able to correct for that selection bias, we did reweight the sample using the previous face-to-face LSMS ISA data set from these countries. And of course, another source of selection bias is even for those households that are selected to participate in the phone survey, there is a possibility that the phone numbers that they provided about a year ago might not be working, or we might not be able to reach them. So that requires that we control for this selection bias. We must also emphasize that the results that we are going to present, especially as it pertains to agriculture, focuses on the pre-harvest, since in most of the countries, as at the time that the rounds of survey that we included in this analysis, it's not their harvest season, so we don't have harvest information. But then we're still working on designing post-harvest modules where we'll probably share with the Agriculture and Food GP to provide their comments and feedback on that as well. So this table shows the rounds of survey data that we are including in our analysis. So the phone survey data that we're including range from the one we collected as far back as April, May in Nigeria and Ethiopia to the most recent one, which is August. But so if you look at the rounds of survey data that we are including for Burkina Faso, we are including the first 2 rounds, which covers July and August. But then at the moment, these countries have conducted multiple more than the rounds of the rounds that we are included here. And I must also say that in these, these 5 countries, we expect them to conduct up to 12 rounds, and we try as much as possible to focus each round of the survey on a different topic. So that helps us to track different aspects of different aspects of the impact of the pandemic over time. So one thing that is very important for us to be able to to make deductions is to ensure that the sample that we have for the high frequency phone survey compares pretty well with the pre-COVID LSMS-ISA data set. So we take a few indicators to see how those indicators vary across the 2 data sets. So for instance, in terms of household size for Nigeria, we see that the pre-COVID data set has a household size of 5.5, and then that of the high frequency phone survey has a household size of 5.5 after reweighting, which makes it make the 2 data sets comparable. Across countries, we see that in terms of the indicators, there is no difference between the 2 data sets. So I will show a few results on agriculture, and then after that, Sydney will come in with some results on food security. So in terms of the results on agriculture, so the pre-COVID data set had questions on whether or not the households participated or cultivated crops or raised livestock, right? So we use that, and then in the high frequency phone survey too, we ask a similar question. So with that, we are able to see the share of households that were involved in agriculture before the pandemic, and then the share that are involved in agriculture after the outbreak. So for instance, if we see the share of households involved in agriculture seem higher after the outbreak than before the start of the pandemic. So for instance, if we take Ethiopia, the share of households that were involved in crop production before the pandemic was a little below 60%, but then this number has increased to about 70% since the start of the pandemic. And we see similar results for Malawi, Nigeria, and then Uganda, except for livestock production in Uganda, where the share of households that were involved in livestock production before the outbreak seemed higher than the share of households undertaking livestock production after the outbreak. So we took a step further to see how households are transitioning in and out of agriculture by looking at those households that were involved in agriculture before the pandemic and those that were not involved in agriculture before the pandemic that are doing so. So here on this slide, the blue lines refers to those households that were involved in agriculture before the pandemic, but then they are not doing so after the outbreak. And then the orange line bars refer to those households that were not involved in agriculture, but then they are doing so since the outbreak. So generally, if we look at crop production, for instance, the share of households that were not involved in agriculture, in crop production, that are doing so now seem higher across countries compared to those that have exited crop production. And then we see similar trend for livestock production, except for Uganda, where the share of households that have entered into livestock production seem lower than the share that have exited. So the other thing that we were interested in is examining household participation in crop and livestock farming by looking at how that varies across the rural-urban divide. So generally, we see that across country, the share of households, the percentage of households involved in that have gone into crop production seem higher than the share of households that have gone into crop production in rural areas. So urban households are engaging more in crop production than their rural counterparts, which is not surprising because for rural areas in the region, agriculture is their main source of livelihood. So for every season, they will definitely be involved in. But then for the urban areas, that might be, the result of, the lockdown restrictions where people were not able to, conduct their, maybe businesses were closed and stuff. So people were transitioning into agriculture, which we find something similar results as well for livestock production. So the other thing that we wanted to understand is how income from households' sources of livelihood, right? Income from those sources have changed since the start of the pandemic. So what we did in the surveys was we asked a question asking about the sources of income that a household has received in the last 12 months, and then how the income from those sources have changed since the start of the pandemic. So we see that generally households reported income loss since the start of the pandemic, and as lockdown eases, so if you look at, for instance, in Ethiopia, if you look at April, May, and then May, June, the bars for May, June seem lower than the bars for April, May, which means as lockdown restrictions are eased to some degree, the loss of income from these sources go down. But then we see that while agriculture has been impacted by, the income from agriculture has been impacted compared to other sources of income, for instance, non-farm family business income, as well as remittances, the agriculture income loss seem better. And of course, we have also wage income, which seem less impacted, which probably is not surprising because for wage income, especially if someone is a teacher or is a civil servant, they will still be, getting paid. So generally income from those sources might not be affected that much. And the next thing that we wanted to understand was besides the impact of the crisis, we also wanted to understand some of the shocks that households in the region are facing. So we asked them, has your household been affected by, let's say, input price shock since mid-March? Mid-March was when the lockdown restrictions were implemented in most of the country. So we asked, since mid-March, has your household been affected by input price shock? So we see that there's some evidence of households experiencing, agricultural households experiencing input price shock. For instance, in Malawi, about 29% of households reported input price shock, while in Nigeria, we have about 46% of households reporting that. And then in terms of output price shock, which is decrease to farming outputs, about 30% of farming households in Malawi reported that, whilst in Nigeria it's about 22%, and then 11% for Uganda. So the other thing that we wanted to understand at the peak of the lockdown restrictions was to know how easy or difficult it was for households to undertake their farming activities during the pandemic. So we see that there is some evidence of households having issues undertaking their crop farming activities. So for instance, in Nigeria, 34% of farming households reported that they had difficulties undertaking their crop farming activities during the lockdown restrictions. So this, we also wanted to understand, given what is happening in the country, specifically for Nigeria, we wanted to understand how households' expectation, farming households' expectations are when it comes to crop harvests and sales, as well as livestock sales. So we see that most households in Nigeria have a positive outlook for output and sales, though over time we see some sort of worsening of expectations when it comes to crop harvest. for Nigeria. And then finally, in terms of livestock expectations, livestock sales, we see that over time, expectations have increased, as we see that the share of households that are reporting that the expectations concerning revenue from livestock sales will increase, will be higher. This was about 49% in August, and that increased to almost 60% in September when they were asked the same question. So I think that is the end of the results on agriculture. I will ask Sydney to present more interesting results on food security. Thanks, everyone. Back to you, Sydney.
Let me just share my screen. Thanks a lot. As Kufo mentioned, we'll a little bit here sharing some findings on the food security situation in the COVID-19 environment. As I'm sure that most of you are very well aware, the food security situation has been a significant issue in the lead up to the pandemic. Here we're looking at the prevalence of food insecurity across the world from 2014 to 2020. And it's very clear that Africa is seeing the highest prevalence for both severe and moderately severe food insecurity. But we also see kind of this upward trend where more and more households are becoming food insecure. So this security could be problematic given the onset of various shocks that come along with that. So in order to be able to monitor and assess that situation, we have integrated the Food Insecurity Experience Scale, or FIAS questions, into the high-frequency phone surveys. This allows for a very current and repeated assessment of the prevalence of food security as the pandemic powers forward, unfortunately. For those that aren't familiar with the FIAS methodology, this is the endorsed methodology for measuring SDG indicator 2.1.2 on the prevalence of food insecurity. The questionnaire that feeds into this computation, it consists of 8 questions that about the incidence of various food-related behaviors and constraints. So ranging from whether or not household members were worried about food, all the way up to whether or not they had to go with a full day without eating. The standard FIAS module, the one that's used for the SDG monitoring, uses a 12-month recall period. But we're interested here in the high-frequency phone surveys in measuring more acute food insecurity and look at this specific impact in this time period. We look at the last 30 days. So in every interview period where they have a FIAS module, we're asking households about the last 30 days. Did they experience these various constraints? So what we see here is that there's quite a range of the prevalence of food insecurity. In Malawi, very high rates, more than 70% in both of those countries, where more than 70% of the adult population is suffering from moderate or severe food insecurity. It's a bit lower in Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, and Uganda, with ranging from 42 to 47%, but still quite high. The orange bars here indicate the severe food insecurity, which is as expected higher in Malawi and Nigeria than their high rates. So look at the distribution of food security, food insecurity. Sorry, it was on my screen. I'm trying to move it. We look at the distribution across consumption quintiles. So what we're doing here is we pair the high frequency phone survey data with the most recent LSMS ISA face-to-face survey, where we have a consumption aggregate, and match those households with their pre-COVID consumption quintiles. So what we see here, the consistent across most countries is that the poorer households experience a disproportionately high rate of food insecurity. And that's true for both moderate and severe food insecurity. The only exception to that pattern here is Nigeria, where we see kind of an odd inverted U shape, which we suspect might be related to more pressure urban areas, which often end up in the higher quintiles. When we look at urban versus rural areas, we see some clear distinctions, particularly in Malawi and Burkina Faso, and Ethiopia to some extent, where rural areas are experiencing much higher rates of moderate, of moderate or severe food insecurity. Nigeria and Uganda, there's no statistically significant difference between the urban and rural prevalence rates. So we've been talking about percentages of population, but that are food insecure, but really what does that look like for households? We've here disaggregated some of the FIAS questions. So the questions that feed into this aggregate probability of food insecurity to look at three particular facets. So in the blue, we're looking at households that reported their members being worried about having enough food to consume. In orange, we have households where members skipped a meal, and in gray is the most severe, where at least one household member went a full day without eating, again, in the last 30 days. It's very clear from looking at this that had at least one member who wouldn't have food. And in Malawi and Nigeria, about 71% of households had a member that had to skip a meal in the last 30 days. That rate is higher than what we see in Uganda and Ethiopia and Burkina Faso, but those countries have quite high rates. And then lastly, we see that at least 10% of all households in each of these countries had a member who went an entire day without eating, again with higher rates in Malawi and Nigeria. One thing that's interesting here is that we see very similar patterns in Malawi and Nigeria, where similar percentage of households were worried about food and also had to skip a meal, where in the other three countries, the prevalence of worrying about food is significantly higher than the prevalence of households that had to skip a meal. We take a look here, zooming into Nigeria really quickly. We look at the food insecurity past and present. So we're able to track the food security status over time by linking the most recent LSMS survey with the high frequency phone survey. And the reason we're zooming into Nigeria specifically in this case is that the LSMS survey also used the 30-day recall period. For the other countries that have FIAS, we're using a 12-month recall period. So for comparability, we're focusing on Nigeria. And so what you see here is that on the left side, you have the food insecurity status as of 20. This is the pre-harvest measure. And then the June 2020 status. And a big shift from households that were not insecure in 2018, moving to a moderate or severely food insecure status in 2020. We also find quite movement when looking at severely food insecure households. So we see that 43% of households who were not severely food insecure in 2018 have now, as of June 2020, into the food insecures. And we've started digging a little bit into kind of the composition of these households that are secure. And there's an urban-rural component where we see that, especially with the severely food insecure, more urban households are making that shift. or there's a disproportionate amount of urban households that are moving from not severely food insecure to severely food insecure. There's also a fairly clear geographic element where we see that certain zones in Nigeria are making bigger shifts. Start to unpack this a little bit and dig into why we might be getting these high rates. Of course, there are many reasons, but in the environment, we see that the households are enduring a wide range of shocks. Akufo started describing some of the agriculture-related shocks. But in general, we see over 83% of households experience some period. One of the most common of which was food price shocks. So in Nigeria, 90% of households reported experiencing an increase in the price of major consumption goods. This rate is 66% in Malawi and 53% in Burkina Faso. We see similar prevalence of food price shocks in urban and rural areas for Nigeria and Burkina Faso, but in Malawi we see a higher rate for rural areas, where rural populations are feeling the pinch of food price shocks more heavily. Shocks, it's important for us to look at the coping mechanisms that households are employing. And one of those is reducing food consumption. So what we're looking at here in this graph is the distribution of, it's the percent of households that are reducing food consumption to cope with shocks. In this case, any shock. Could be food prices, could be agricultural shocks, household health, etc. Which is the very high rate in Nigeria, where overall 66% of households reported reducing their food consumption in order to cope with in July 2020. The other kind of interesting finding here is that we see a pretty statistically similar incidence across consumption quintiles. In most countries, Nigeria, there's a little bit of a blip, but the lower quintiles don't seem to be reducing food consumption more than those in the higher end of the distribution. But just a kind of a caveat to that is that we do see some evolution in the food insecurity situation. So we're able to look at consecutive Ethiopia and Nigeria. This shocks questionnaire was administered in April or May, and then in June or July. So we're able to look at household coping mechanisms across time as the pandemic persists. And we see generally an increase in the percent of households that are reducing food consumption as a coping mechanism. But also very importantly is we see a very distinct jump for households that are in the lower end of the consumption distribution, suggesting that the more poor households are having to reduce their food consumption, which is worrisome as this COVID environment seems as it will persist for quite some time. I think kind of the key takeaways are that we do see agriculture acting as a buffer for households in the region. We see households transitioning into agriculture since the start of the pandemic, most of which are from urban areas. And while households are experiencing a significant number of input and output shocks, the majority of households are still able to perform activities normally. And again, we see evidence of a worsening food security situation, particularly in Nigeria, but this may be the case in other countries as well. We have found that these phone surveys do offer an opportunity to monitor and understand both agriculture and food security as this pandemic evolves. And as Akufo mentioned in the beginning, this is something where we are evolving the high frequency phone survey questionnaires as well. So not only will we, once the agricultural season ends, we'll have more data on harvest, outputs, etc. As different topics come up, we're evolving with the situation. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Laura, and we're happy to take questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Akufu and Sydney. That was really interesting and such a thorough examination of the results. I'd like to pass it now to Dorte for questions that she might have or comments on the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you so much for the presentation and for doing all this work. And you guys have done an amazing job. And if we have worked together right from the beginning, I think my heart would have had a little bit of an easier time, because honestly, in the last 8 months, it has been heart-wrenching. What you have been doing is laudable. It's what we have needed. We need to shed light on what people's situation, their vulnerability, and the coping mechanisms are in the countries in Africa. So when the pandemic started, we were really, really struggling. And it was really, really hard, because first of all, a number of us, we feared that the secondary effect of the pandemic, including food security, would be tougher than the COVID itself. So we were struggling, trying to figure out how to get timely information. So the one piece of information we get right away is, of course, prices. So that led us to look at the supply side more than the demand side. So we knew that from elsewhere, we already had seen it in Asia, that the supply chain were breaking down. And by monitoring the prices, we could see that the prices were rising fast because of border closing and other supply side breakdown. Because these breakdowns that affect prices pretty much right away. And also many of the countries in Africa are really already vulnerable, particularly in terms of macroeconomics. And that also reflected in prices, right? We saw that many of the countries many are really very WFP and UNHCR, and it's very clear when these two organizations don't collect the data, the poorest and the most vulnerable in the most vulnerable countries, we don't really know about. And in particular, the refugees. And I hope that you would have done some extra work, but it's very difficult because most of the statistical offices in the countries, including Uganda, don't include information on food and nutrition in their surveys of the refugees. And my next point relates to the rural-urban migration. We know that many, as I mentioned, that many are leaving urban areas and going to rural areas. And therefore, they might have started to help their families and friends in the rural areas produce. So that's what Maya have seen. More production, but it doesn't mean that more harvest, right? And there could also be some seasonality in the findings. And I don't know well all the countries, but since I work very closely with Ethiopia and Malawi, I know that there are likely some seasonalities in the data that you have. For example, in Ethiopia, the bell rains, they start in June and the crop harvest in October, December. So the early survey, the pre-COVID, the January, February survey, and post-COVID, that was in July, August, would have some differences due to this. Also in Malawi, there's the same thing. I'm not going to go into the details, but one thing that was important was the election in Malawi, where the current president, who was a candidate at the time, went out and promised massive subsidy programs. So many people that were thinking of going into farming might have gone in because they hoped that they would get access to these subsidies. Then we didn't hear much about nutrition. Nutrition is key, right? I wonder if you have focused on calories, and you have focused also on the micronutrients, etc. Because otherwise, we're just going to be left where we were with a large number of children that are chronically malnourished, right? And then a little bit on the coping mechanisms. I think you're very kind, but there are many other coping mechanisms that is maybe difficult to capture in the phone survey. And we know from WFP's work and others that document that girls are being married off early, so the family don't have another person to feed. And there's also a lot of food for sex going on in Africa right now. And finally, I'd like to invite you to discuss with our teams in the countries, and maybe we can have a session on where you present this to our African colleagues, so you can get some of the granular details that I, of course, didn't get in a presentation that was only 30 minutes. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dorte. That was an excellent set of questions and reflections on how this is useful and maybe could be strengthened even further. Let me now pass to Aslihan for her comments, and then I think we'll pass back to the presenters to respond, and then we'll bring in some of the audience's questions. So over to you, Aslihan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Laura. And well, I guess first of all, good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to actually start by thanking both Sydney and Akufo, as well as the wider World Bank LSMS ISA team that are basically at the forefront of collecting data using phone surveys, which RIA, which is my division, Research and Impact Assessment Division at IFAD, we are struggling with collecting data using the phone surveys. So I really congratulate them for their like really cutting edge work on that, and a great work also in this study. So I have like 3 main points that I will try to make, and then hopefully within 5 minutes, and then I will leave maybe some other things for later in the Q&A session. One of them, the first one is related to mainly policy and program design, because from a point of view of IFAD and maybe other funding agencies, we are now basically repurposing a lot of our projects to be able to target and help these kinds of food insecurity issues that we've been observing in response to COVID. So in order to be able to better target those types of interventions, the one that we have at IFAD is called Rural Poor Stimulus Facility. We really need a better understanding, like this data provide us, about the impacts of the COVID and also the food insecurity situation. But maybe we can look at the data even better to understand a larger, like an overall set of characteristics of households, as Sydney already mentioned that they're looking into more and more, to understand what are the types of households actually that need more support than others in these circumstances. So we have seen a lot, you know, in and out of agriculture or changes in income. But these are also mainly like binary indicators that we have from the phone surveys, right? But the team, LSMS team, has a tremendous advantage of having the previous rounds of the LSMS ISA surveys, in which they have really a wealth of information that can provide us these characteristics, right? Because from the previous LSMS ISA surveys that I have worked with, we have basically data. Let's say I have about 7 countries that I worked with, the older data. We know that the share of income that comes from agriculture is about 50% on average. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. Well, let's say it's 50. So when we see a decrease in agricultural income, there's still this the rest of the income that is a very significant share. And we also observe in this data that the biggest loss was in the non-farm business income, right? I mean, not in terms of magnitude, the incidence of income loss, and then followed by remittance loss and wage income loss. So these were also the types of things that we had tried to identify as characteristics of households that we need to pay attention to when we wrote a blog. There was a Rio blog at the beginning of the pandemic. So can we look at the main thing and feedback is, can we use the previous rounds of data where we have the amounts of income from every source that you can think of, very detailed, and to understand what is the share of income from agriculture versus business versus remittances and others. So we can really have a better understanding of the income portfolio of households and how their food insecurity fares, depending on what they depend on most. And then we can use that type of information maybe to better target repurposed interventions or other types of interventions in response, right? And this they can do because nobody else can do that, because they have the panel data from the earlier rounds of the LSMS. So this is a tremendous advantage they have to help both general understanding and the policy and interventions on the ground. So the second point I wanted to raise was, let me see, oh yeah, I think it was Nigeria, right? Nigeria seems to be interesting. I mean, it clearly stands out in many components here. We have the highest price shocks and food insecurity and everybody even skipping meals, like so many negative things happening. So it seems like part of it is related to the oil price shock, right? Because Nigeria is dependent on oil exports. And then we had prices plummeting, basically. So it would be very interesting also to unpack it a bit more and then see the change in the food price shocks, because we have a high reporting incidence also on food price shocks. But probably in Nigeria, it was also really bad in the past. So can we also have an understanding between the earlier rounds of the data and later rounds of the data to see how that incidence of food price shocks have changed under COVID and how it overlapped with the oil price changes. So to disentangle a bit the issues at hand, right? Because it's really, it is heartbreaking to see those graphs, to see Nigeria, 80% of people having to, skip a meal or worry about, not having enough food to eat. So I think Nigeria deserves definitely more attention. Oh, one more thing that actually is also interesting there is, in spite of all that, a lot of people in Nigeria actually have a positive outlook. So can we also please figure out what they're onto so we can also have a positive outlook, all of us? So that would be useful, I think. And just lastly, let me see. Oh yeah, okay. So I realized in the food insecurity, there was only adults presented. So I just wanted to have a clarification on how come you chose to only report on adults, because, child food insecurity also is usually reported in the national representative surveys. So maybe I'll stop there. Before I stop though, if among the listeners we have anybody who's on the ground, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of having phone numbers, right? Because we have now 10 countries where we're trying to do impact assessments under COVID, and we cannot do this type of great work because we do not have phone numbers in our normal M&E data records from our beneficiaries. So because our LSMS colleagues had these phone numbers from previous rounds, they were able to do such a great work. So anybody on the ground, anybody involved in M&E, please collect phone numbers, because you never know, you're gonna need to run a phone survey to respond to an emergency. And then having phone numbers, especially in this age of digital agriculture, digital everything, is very important for your beneficiaries and development community at large. So thanks, I'll stop there and then I'll come in later for Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Dorte and Aslihan. Excellent set of questions. I think you covered lots of different areas there, looking at trying to say a bit more on the income impacts using the prior data. Can you say a bit more on the coping mechanisms, particularly for vulnerable households? How well are they covered in your data? And how things have been evolving over the time period that you've been collecting these data. So let me hand it back to Akufu and Sydney to see how they can respond to those questions. And then we have some really excellent questions from the audience. So then I'd like to move on to those. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Aslan and Dorte, for this comprehensive point. We really appreciate that. I will try and then attend some of them, and then Sydney can also come as well. So in terms of for Dorte's first question, which was why did we select the 5 countries? So we selected these 5 countries. 1, because these are the countries that we had data for, and then 2, these are the countries that the LSMS ISA team actually supports the phone survey. Of course, there are phone surveys going on within that other units within the bank are supporting, but these are the countries that we are actually supporting. And besides that, we also support Tanzania and Malawi. But then we don't have for Tanzania, there were a few issues here and there, so we couldn't get the fieldwork started in time. So that is why we don't have data for Tanzania and Mali as well. So in terms of limitations of the data, yes, and which group did we capture the most vulnerable or the poor refugees, and then, as to working with the NSOs. So in terms of that, what I would say is yes, when it comes to the phone survey, it is really, very difficult to reach a select group of people, especially when the sample is drawn from an existing survey. So in that case, there is some sort of limitations. But besides that, there is a group within our team that are actually looking at the characteristics of the households, looking differently about comparing in detail the phone survey sample to the previous face-to-face sample, looking at more detailed different indicators. In the presentation, I only showed a few indicators like asset ownership. I looked at car and then TV said that there is a team that is actually looking into much detail the characteristics of the household of the households included in the phone survey. And then of course, in terms of the results, seasonality, yes, it's a little difficult to rule out seasonality, in the sense that this phone survey, especially when it comes to agriculture and then a lot of other things, like happening in the country, it is very difficult to rule out seasonality. But yeah, but that is something that probably we'll have to look deeper at, probably beyond the scope of this brief. But that is something that we can take a deeper look at in a separate work. And in terms of looking at calories, so that is also something that we can look at. But in terms of the food security results that we presented, we're not looking at the calorie intake, but rather looking at the using the FIES, the Food Insecurity Experience Scale developed by the Food and Agriculture Organization. That is what we are using to assess the food security. And in terms of coping mechanism, okay, so I think, yeah, so in terms of coping mechanism, so for this exercise, for our work, we only limited to households reducing food consumption to cope with the impact of the crisis. But then there are other coping, like mechanisms that we ask beyond just reducing food. Some of another work done by one of our team, they looked at, they explored, and one of the things that they realized was not only were households reducing food consumption, but then they were also drawing down on their savings and then assets. So that is also, like another aspect of, like coping strategies that households are adopting. And then the next one is, so we will actually appreciate, having a further discussion with the team on how to relay this to other African colleagues. And then let me try and then see if I can respond to some of the comments from Aslan as well. So in terms of, target food insecure households, so that also comes to, in terms of the policy and the program design and looking at the characteristics of households that need more support. So that leads to the point I made earlier about a different team within our unit actually looking at, the characteristics of the households. And Aslan also mentioned about the income loss as a result of, remittances going down. And then of course, non-farm enterprises, income from non-farm enterprises also going down. So that is not surprising in terms of, because remittances here, for instance, here in the US, if I have to send money home and, I am not working, then definitely I'm not going to be able to, get the money to them. And of course, then in that case, those who rely on remittances from me, they are kind of, not going to have access to that. And similarly, in terms of, income loss from non-farm enterprise, that is also not surprising because at the peak of, the closures, right, the restrictions, businesses and staff were equally, closed. So income from that is not surprising. And then in terms of Nigeria specifically, yes, there are a lot of things going on in Nigeria in terms of, the findings. And like you rightly said, yes, Nigeria is, the country is highly dependent on, oil is the backbone of the Nigerian economy. So it's probably not, we're seeing all these results because at the time of, COVID crisis at the start, at the same time, the global fall in oil prices might have contributed to some of these other results that we are seeing, which definitely will require that we do, probably more digging to understand, to disentangle the impact of other shocks from just the COVID crisis. And then the other thing with Nigeria, irrespective of all that is going on, is that at least for the most part, we are really positive, irrespective of what is going on. So that is why we see people in terms of expected output and then expected sales. The numbers are really high for Nigeria. And then the last point from Aslan was about the food security and why are we considering adults. So I think the reason why we are considering adults is the way the questions were structured. So for some of the countries, the questions were phrased to ask about the last 30 days. Did any adults, were you worried that adults in your household will not have sufficient food to eat because of money or lack of money or other resources? So in order for us to have something uniform, we weighted the results, the sample using the adult weight rather than the full household weight. So that is why we have the results as such. So Is there anything else I missed, Sydney, want to comment?
Just to add a little bit on the adults, that was a very good point, Aslan, and I think it all of the countries, so in the analysis that we're using here, so we have used the adult population weighted estimates. In subsequent rounds of the FIAS or of the high frequency survey, all countries then reverted to using all members. So in subsequent rounds, we do have the exact FIAS questionnaire design. What else? Yeah, I think, Aslan, you also raised a very good point.
Can't hear you, Sydney.
Sydney, we can't hear you. Sydney?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Is it okay?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Sydney. If you want to continue without video, and we'll go to the Q&A from the audience. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I think, let's see. Yes, can you hear me now? Is it okay?
Yeah,
Yes.
seems okay. You got cut in my very good point, so you can continue from there.
No, I think on the linking the possibility of linking the panel data to the phone survey data in terms of looking at the prevalence of shocks, I think that's something that will definitely carry forward and take into consideration. That's a very good idea. Other than that, I think Akufo covered it all, but just to thank both Aslan and Dorte for the good feedback and suggestions. So thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. So I've put together some clusters of questions that the audience has put forward. I've grouped them into 3 areas. So the areas are coping strategies, price shocks, and then methods. So let's start with the coping strategies. So one of the questions that has come through is with regards to the transitions into agriculture as a coping mechanism, do the surveys capture anything on the migration from urban to rural areas, either due to employment loss or remittance loss? Then I saw that in your food security section, you explored a little bit into the prevalence of food security between urban and rural households, but have you looked into households that are in agriculture versus relying on other wage or income sources, and who seems to be suffering based off of livelihoods? Your earlier results showed quite a lot of exiting from livestock. Should that be interpreted as a coping strategy? Do you have anything to say on that? And then looking at the you've seen evidence about the impact of lower income, higher food prices on agricultural spending for the rural smallholders, so spending on inputs and other investments, and will the effects of these investments constraints show up over time as lower productivity, lower quality? Should we have concerns on that? So let me hand back to you just on these coping strategies, and then we'll go to other clusters of questions that we've received. Thank you. Sydney, do you want to come in first on responses to those questions?
Sure, thank you. Just taking a peek at our tables, because so we have looked at food security by agricultural and non-agricultural households, in addition to the urban rural. it was quite similar to the urban-rural disaggregation. So we elected to only go with one for presentation purposes. Yes, we also, I mean, there's not a clear cross-country story, at least, with whether or not agricultural households are more food insecure or less food insecure than the non-agricultural households. In many cases, so I'm looking in Ethiopia and Malawi, in Malawi, Nigeria, we see that agricultural households suffer from higher rates of food insecurity, of severe food insecurity. But in Uganda, for example, we see that agricultural households are less likely to be severely food insecure. So there is some cross-country heterogeneity there. Spending, that's a good point. So the questionnaires do allow us to look at not on the quantity of inputs, barriers and constraints to applying inputs as a household normally would. So we do see, we haven't included it in this presentation, but it's possible with the data to look at kind of the barriers to using fertilizer or accessing labor and other transportation, for example, so mobility restrictions. So we do have, we're able to look at the incidence of those, but not necessarily the quantification. So that's something that we can add to this. Akufo, any thoughts to that?
Yeah, so thanks, Sydney. The other thing was migration. So I think I'm not sure about the other countries, but for Nigeria, we have collected, I think, in the second round, something about either the second or the third round. We've asked questions about migration as to whether the household has, like, moved from their previous location since the start of the pandemic. So that is something that, like, we can take a look at some point. And then the other thing is was on transitioning out of livestock as a coping strategy, especially for Uganda. I would say probably yes, because if from other work done by one of our team members, one of the coping strategy was relying on savings and then assets. So probably, and of course, livestock we know is a pretty good asset especially for rural households. So it is possible that maybe they are selling livestock as a coping strategy. So that will be the addition to the city. And back to Laura.
Great. No, thanks for those responses. So let's move on to the price shocks, or the discussion around prices. So yeah, there was some feedback from the audience where they've heard this sort of contradictory dynamic of falling crop output prices and rising food prices. Their hypothesis has been due to higher costs of doing business, so transport and last mile distribution primarily, and possible arbitrage opportunities by middlemen. Is there anything in your data that you could say to corroborate or refute this? There was also a question of, with the easing of lockdown, are you seeing food price increases relaxing, or are they still persistent? Have you been looking at triangulating your price shock results with other sources of price information? So either from the WFP or FAO, some of the market monitoring data, and looking at how what you're seeing in the survey compares to these other data sources. And then, just a pretty basic question. I think in your slides on price shocks, it wasn't very specific. Could you be clearer on the price shocks were all negative, in the sense that both input prices were going up and output prices were going down, or was there anything different on that? So for example, you know, with higher demand, maybe output prices may have raised. So if you could clarify that. Okay, Akufu, you're still live, so at least on my screen. So let you kick us off. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Laura, and thanks to the audience for the questions. So as to the price shocks, yeah, so it's a little difficult to say that, because the way the questions are asked, so we are not actually using price data for these to examine the price shocks. We pose the questions to them asking, has your household been affected by this particular shock? So in that case, for instance, when it comes to input price shock, we'll say, has your household experienced increase in farming, the price of farming inputs in the last, since the start of the pandemic? So based on that, that is the results from that is what we are presenting. But then I also agree that it will be very more interesting to try and then triangulate these results with actual, like price data to see how our results, corroborate those actual price data. And the next one was, okay. And the other one was why both input and output price shocks are negative. So this, again, they are incidents, so they are not actual price information that we are using. So probably that is what is explaining that. Sydney, is this something that you want to add or I missed? I got only three questions written down, so hopefully I
Sure. Yeah, just to clarify, on the questions were phrased for the price shocks, they were a specific direction. So for inputs, we asked a shock with input prices and decreasing output prices. So the direction was made explicit in the question, as well as for food price shocks. Of course, that is an increase in food price. Yeah, I think this, there were two other things that I wanted to clarify or address. One of which is this idea of looking at the incidence of food price shocks as the lockdown eases. And I think this is something that we can certainly do. I think now, because this analysis only includes up to 4 rounds in Nigeria and fewer rounds in the other countries. So I think now, given the additional data that has accumulated, we could have a better sense, incorporating more and looking at how the government response has changed. We have looked at using the government stringency index, looking at how kind of the intensity of the government reactions and how it relates to the period of time in which the interviews took place. So I think that's a very good idea. I think now, especially that we have more data accumulated, we can do something like that more effectively. The other thing is the triangulation using alternative price data. I think that's a very good idea, at least to kind of support the story that we're telling here. Hopefully it would support the story. Yeah, because as Akufu mentioned, we don't have actual prices. We have only the incidence of price. So it is something that we could look into doing to kind of validate the storyline. So thank you for that suggestion. Mm-hmm.
Great. No, I think there's some good responses. I would just suggest, I mean, maybe this builds from Dorte's point earlier, where she mentioned that the surveys can be a really useful tool in terms of trying to understand more about what is households, particularly in rural areas, experience. And where we do have some data is this food price data from various other sources. So the triangulation, I think, is super important. But also this point that was raised by one of our participants about, you've shown that there are these sort of contradictory forces, these well, you're seeing higher input prices. I don't think you have a question then on the crop output prices. That would be really helpful to include to confirm that, and then to try to understand if what you find there is this falling crop output price. What is it that smallholder farmers in Africa are explaining? Is it that they're facing transport constraints or difficulties in distribution, and maybe what options are available to them? So you may know that our team in the bank focuses on digital agriculture as well as data-driven agriculture, and we've certainly seen this emergence of agri-e-commerce in countries. For example, in Kenya, it's really taken off. And so trying to bring a bit more contextual information about, is that an option? Has that availed these pressures in certain areas? I think would be really useful. Now, in the interest of time, I want to kind of shift to our last set of questions on methods. So I think some of these have been covered. You discussed sort of the choice of countries. I think through the chat, there were some shared links to blogs and to the website, so we can see what data is available for other countries and on the methodologies. And I shared some information about a complementary effort from poverty colleagues, where there's more coverage of other countries. There were some questions around your choice of, I know you must be very limited in how many questions you can fit into a phone survey, but could you say a little bit more about how you choose questions from round to round? Maybe how participants or how other people could possibly provide inputs into this. I know there must be a difficult coordination problem on this, but I think that our audience and our discussion has been very rich today, and maybe they've made some suggestions that could possibly be considered for future rounds, and maybe there's a way for us to kind of systematize this more in the future. There was a question specific to Ethiopia and taking into account locust impacts. Whether you think what you're showing here is a lower bound based off of your sample, or whether you think that this is representative across the wealth distribution. And then I think a last question that would be really helpful to spend some time on today is, what does this mean in terms of how we use data to inform policy and our understanding of agriculture and food security across Africa and across other countries? Should we be thinking of these types of survey methods as a new normal? They enable more rapidly available data. They allow this more iterative understanding of the situation on the ground. And maybe there's even more that we can do than what you're doing with the phone surveys. So for example, have you looked into SMS surveys, things that could be really, really quick and low cost to implement? Or have you looked into other methods? So for example, using social media, that might be sort of more applicable in some countries like Nigeria, for example, where there's a high uptake of that, and that being incredibly low cost to gather information, as well as triangulating it with other sources, so like the news media, what people are talking about on the radio, in other public sources. So I think it would be helpful to kind of think data doesn't always need to get generated through traditional survey methods. They clearly have their value, but maybe this is actually opening some new doors for us in terms of how we harness information and data from the field and use it to inform activities. So sorry, quite a lot there. So let me turn it back to both of you and see what you'd like to respond to there. Thank you.
I'll take maybe a couple of these and then pass it over to Akufo. But the question on locusts, I think, is really important. And it's something that we have been discussing within the team and with the Ethiopia team and the people on the ground there. There is some data on locusts included in the high frequency phone surveys in round 6 of Ethiopia. And at that point, the incidence was still quite low. It was pretty isolated to the Afar region. But we do expect, or unfortunately expect, that this incidence will grow. So in the current version of the survey that's in the field, there was back and forth with the agriculture GP and some more discussion on what questions should be asked. And so this is kind of an example of an evolving questionnaire design. So in the next iteration of data, we will have a more detailed questions on the locust invasion, but currently we haven't seen a high incidence nationally, at least. So we think what we're seeing, particularly in these rounds of data that we've analyzed here, is not related to locusts, is our suspicion. I think future and the future of surveys, I think a lot of these questions that come up are difficult. Of course, we want more data and we want more detailed data, but phone surveys, while they're extremely valuable and cost effective and quick, they also have limitations in terms of the amount of detail that you can ask or types of questions. For example, for agriculture, we can't necessarily ask about parcel level data. Everything is in aggregate and not so much looking at levels, so price levels or output is trickier. So I think as countries start going back to the field, there will be a place for mixed mode surveys where we can work on utilizing both. So working face-to-face surveys in with periodic phone surveys to kind of maximize costs and value and efficiency going forward. But I think phone surveys alone, at least for detailed data, there's still a bit room for improvement. Akufo, do you want to add to that?
Thanks, Sydney. So the other thing that I want to touch on is how we choose questions across rounds. Yeah, so that is we normally have we collaborate with the National Statistics Offices, who normally will provide us with what they will want to like the areas that you want to focus on, and then based on that we design the question. And of course, it's, as I said in the presentation, the exercise is a collaboration between the LSNS and the poverty GP. So we work together to select the questions to include. And then the other thing too is since we have the previous face-to-face exercise, and then of course we have an indication of what variables to like compare. That also like the previous face-to-face design also help us to like know the sort of questions to include as well. And then of course, as to what this means for use of data going forward, yes, like Sydney said, in some of the countries they've actually started face-to-face data collection. So we going to have like mixed modes, depends on the data need. So the other thing, so in line with that, definitely there are some as pertains to phone surveys, there is less you can do because it's going to be difficult to be asking for production at plot parcel level. The respondent might not like understand, and you have limited time when you are doing the phone survey. So with that, there is less we can do. But then the good thing is the phone survey provides some rapid data to do some immediate analysis. So that is what I will add. So we address the cost, and yep. So thanks. Back to you, Laura.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think we're almost out of time here. I was just writing a message. I wonder whether Akufu and Sydney, you would be willing to share your contacts through the chat so that participants could follow up with any questions that we didn't quite get covered. I think Aslihan had a very good question that we didn't have time to circle back to. So maybe, and maybe there are others in the audience. So if that's something you're comfortable, I think that would be very helpful. So thank you everyone for participating today, the presenters, the discussants, and of course the audience. I think we've had an incredibly rich discussion. We've learned a lot about what you can learn from these surveys, also some of the limitations, and hopefully we've made some constructive suggestions on what might be useful to consider in future rounds. I do see these as being a very useful tool in the future and complementing existing methods as well as opening up other methods similar to phone surveys, but maybe through SMS or through social media. Just to conclude, I'd like to kind of mention that this webinar is part of the World Bank's Data-Driven and Digital Agricultural webinar series. In this series, we invite innovators, thought leaders, and World Bank task teams and technical staff who are looking at transforming agriculture and food system using data-driven and digital agriculture. Our next webinar is going to be on the 3rd of December after the Thanksgiving break. We'll have panelists from the OECD, FAO, GODAN, and Oxera, and we'll be talking about strengthening data governance in the sector, looking at the current state, where there are challenges and possible ways forward. And so that relates to more the fact that with the emergence of digital agriculture, a lot more data is being harnessed in the sector. That could be tremendously valuable, but there are some questions around governance of that data. So we'll be looking at and exploring those questions. It'd be great if some of you are able to join. We'll send an invitation out soon. So on that note, thanks everyone, and really enjoyed this webinar, and look forward to having you participate again in the future. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everyone.
Everyone.
Appreciate this. Thanks. Have a good one.